We are at 63rd and Western, and this is the building where the draft boards, 32 draft boards covering the whole south side of Chicago, were located here. And we rented an office in the building as a bookstore, and this is where we got into the draft board offices and removed a lot of the material, mountains of files and cards, and burned them outside. We did not endanger the building, or much less endanger the life of anybody in there or anywhere around here. Today I'm interviewing my friend Staughton Lynd, who of course was very much involved in the movement, the resistance against the war in Vietnam. With the 50th anniversary of the Chicago 15 draft board action coming up, I would just be very interested, Staughton, in how that action and other similar actions, the Catonsville 9, the Milwaukee 14, how those seemed to you, what your opinion was of those, and whether you felt that they contributed to the movement of resistance against the war in Vietnam. So any reflections you would have, positive or critical, would be much appreciated.
There were, of course, large marches, and I had been chairperson of the initial march of Students for a Democratic Society in Washington, D.C. in April 1965. But folks wanted to do something more than walk about carrying signs and then go home on a chartered bus. And so let's think of some of the different ways people found. My wife, Alice, came up with a very creative personal solution because the problem for the wives of movement activists like Stokely Carmichael and Tom Hayden and Paul Potter and Staughton Lynd was that there was this never-ending flood of won't you come to Crossroads X on date Z and give a speech. Uh, I was told after coming back from Hanoi that no one like you in the movement, Staughton, for bringing out a crowd. So I thought, well, okay, if that's what I can contribute, that's what I'll do. And that's what I did. And marriage after a marriage in the movement collapsed because of that pattern where men like myself were asked to run around the country giving speeches, and women like my wife Alice found themselves to a degree trapped in the house, taking care of the children as best they could. People found different solutions. Alice herself became a draft counselor and was at one point in a coordinating position with all the draft resistors in the Chicago metropolitan area. It came a little later, but other movement people created coffee houses. But meantime, people were seeking these other forms of action. And I consider the so-called ultra-resistance of Catholics led by the Berrigan brothers as a very significant form of that resistance, because it involved going into a selective service office or a facility that stored nuclear weapons and doing as much damage as you could before the police arrived. And then you had the folks that included Father Joe Mulligan, who is taping these remarks, activity that was coordinated by the brothers Daniel and Phil Berrigan, and involved going into selective service offices, pouring blood on the files, setting the fires alight with napalm, which I imagine gave a particular satisfaction to the person doing it. And there were literally dozens of such actions at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s.
So our people were in this building, and at one point at about 5 a.m. they broke into the draft board offices and started gathering up all the files, and then at one point they started coming down this fire escape with all the files. I was waiting out here in the car, and I had the gasoline which we used to douse the draft material and set it on fire.
And evaluation You know, we're talking about imponderables here. You act, you don't know if your act will change anything, but you take it because you feel whatever obligation you have to to God, to a set of ethical principles, to even common notions of decency, you have to do something about this terrible activity of your own government on the other side of the world to this essentially defenseless people, people with no anti-aircraft uh, capability, people who died, I don't know, 10, 25, 100 for every single American combatant that died. I mean, there were between 50 and 60,000 of those. So it was a matter, like all of these efforts, of human beings simply throwing themselves against what seemed like a kind of historical tank that was crushing all in front of it.
The draft boards located here covered the whole south side of Chicago. And so the people who were registered here were members of minority groups, especially blacks and Hispanics, who were inducted and served in Vietnam in very disproportionate numbers. So part of our reason for choosing this particular set of draft boards was to dramatize that. Do you think that these actions, the draft board actions, might have encouraged some young men who were facing the draft to think seriously about that matter and to feel encouraged or supported in their own resistance?
There is no way to pontificate about this matter. You never know. But it may be that that rebelliousness, that insistence on caring for someone who you never met, who lived 8,000 miles away, but who your country was systematically destroying, it may be that it had some effect on the conscript army, because at about the same time, before and after 1970, the United States military in Vietnam went to pieces. Soldiers refused to go out on midnight sorties on trails that had already been made so that the enemy could expect you to be coming and prepare for it. These people, these frontline combatants, found their own forms of resistance. And some of it, of course, was getting drunk and getting high and playing music from their particular part of the States. But some of it was just saying no when they were ordered to make missions that they considered senseless. And in a few cases, apparently, actually harming, even killing, the brash young lieutenants from the Ivy League who sent them into these nonsense traps.
So very shortly, the Chicago police arrived and took us away to police station and then to Cook County Jail, where we spent a few days before we were bailed out. We were first charged with burglary and arson by the state of Illinois, and then by the federal government with 4 counts in an indictment, including destruction of government property, interfering with the Selective Service system, and conspiracy to do those things. And then after a while, the state dropped their charges, and we were prosecuted by the federal government.
Those of us who sought civilian forms of resistance, if, like Father Mulligan himself and so many others who participated in the actions led by Catholics to destroy Selective Service records, if my going to Hanoi, which the president of Yale called action aiding and supporting the enemy, which is a phrase from the law of treason, which has a capital punishment penalty, if all of those things contributed, and let me speak for the soul of Norman Morrison and say, if he would say the same about his own ultimate sacrifice, if it added anything to the ability of the troops in Vietnam to stop the war, then let it be. It was that which whoever superintendents or supervises our comings and goings in this life would have wanted us to do. Nothing like that had ever happened in United States history before. I mean, smaller things. A mutiny in George Washington's army, the desertion of some of the people who invaded Mexico on a date which Mexicans still celebrate annually. This was, although not coordinated, taking many different forms, this was bigger than that.
Our trial was held in the Federal Building in Chicago. Our trial lasted about a month in 1970. We tried to present some of our reasons for the protest action, but the judge basically refused to allow us to present anything about the Vietnam War or the draft.
And just to end with my own kind of positive feeling about where it leaves us, the Army and its civilian colleagues said to itself, I think this is a historical fact, Well, the army is in this sad shape because it is a conscripted army. People are dragged into military service against their wishes, and then we get upset when they don't like it. We know what we'll do, these people said to each other. We'll create a volunteer army. What I have noticed in such research as my wife and I have been enabled to conduct is that these conscript soldiers of the Vietnam era have been replaced by volunteers. And you know what? When those volunteers are asked to do the same nonsensical and murderous things in Afghanistan, in Iraq, all over the world, some of them at least are beginning to react in exactly the same way that those conscripts did against the Vietnam War. There is something in every human being. Quakers call it an inner light. Others speak of the voice of God. I'm not sure that the name matters. With all our propensity to evil, we human beings have the ability to tell the right from the wrong. And these actions that we took were actions to touch that rightness, that sense of morality, of ethical imperatives in our fellow citizens and other human beings everywhere.
Staughton, I was wondering, would you say that these actions of either pouring napalm or pouring blood on files in those offices, or pouring napalm or gasoline on the files after having broken into the draft board offices, bringing the material out, would you say that that fits under within the limits, the parameters of nonviolence, maybe a militant nonviolence?
Oh,
But
I think
basically,
it is
it
nonviolent.
is.
I mean, you're taking what? Sometimes prison up to 5 years, maybe more often 2 years, but you're taking a chunk of your life and offering it, offering it, not manhandling any other human being, to the best of my knowledge.
Right.